My name's Jennifer Wilkie. I've taught fourth grade elementary in Ithaca City Schools for about 12 years, and I've been on special assignment to support STEM education and interdisciplinary education. And I'm here with three friends and colleagues we represent formal and informal and secondary education here in Ithaca, and we'd like to share some of our experiences, insights, and successes and visions with you. So maybe if you wouldn't mind starting introducing yourself a little bit, maybe a bit about how you came to your work and what you do in your field. Do you want to start, Michelle? Yeah.
Well, that's an awful lot, and I'll try to do it. I'm Michelle Kortenaar. I work at the Sciencenter here in town. I started off as a teacher, and my background is in biology, so I started off as a biology teacher. And very early in my career, I was asked to teach physics because there were only men teaching physics, and they wanted a woman. And I figured I could learn it faster than the students in the class could. I ended up teaching AP physics just before I came to Ithaca, so I did learn it faster than they did. And the thing I guess I wanted to share tonight was things we're trying to do that make women feel encouraged and welcome, and that they don't. This sort of was a difficult movie in many ways to watch, but we're really working at the Sciencenter to be inclusive of girls and empowering of girls and finding ways of including and making them welcome in the programs we do so that they feel like they can just live by their inventions and maybe not by their faces.
Hi, my name is Jay Sweet, and I am the Senior Director for Student Development and Academic Affairs at the College of Veterinary Medicine here at Cornell. I'm not a veterinarian. My PhD is actually in human development and developmental psychology with a focus on adolescent development, and I came into administration purely by circumstance and chance, and the vet school was one of my first administrative positions. And what's unique about the vet school, for those of you who don't know, I mean, this is nationwide, not just at Cornell, is that it is predominantly female. So it's obviously very science-focused. It's a medical field, but 80% of the students at the vet school are women, and that has been a pretty phenomenal transition that's happened over a period of, I think, 25 to 30 years. It's transformed from predominantly male to going 50% male, 50% female, to now being predominantly female. So it's, there's a constant discussion even now at the national level about how that came to be and why that is. And I think it's just an interesting contrast with some of the other science areas of science, and I think that might be worth discussing too. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Carlan Gray. I am currently the Associate Principal for Curriculum Instruction at Ithaca High School, and I was a biology teacher for 13 years, I think, at Ithaca High School. And I got to watch my class grow from a class of 13 kids my first year to about 100 over time, and I've watched the same pattern over time in secondary schools and the rise of girls, especially in biology and especially in medical fields, rise to the occasion even more so than males. And I've spent a lot of time questioning how we can create programming in the Ithaca City School District in collaboration with Jen to increase the productivity of our science education, but also to increase enrollment for girls in STEM programming. And at Ithaca High School, we have about 250 some courses and a massive increase in STEM programming over the last 5 years, especially.
Thanks for that. So as I was preparing for this and doing a bunch more reading and thinking about the work that we do and what's working, I keep coming back to a phrase called collective impact, and how we can tease out lots of parts, but thinking about how all of those work together to make this impact that we're seeing. So I wondered if you might each speak a little bit to moves that you've either been able to make or have seen effective in your spheres of influence that have helped to change this culture for young women to help them be successful?
So I'll say one of the things we've done is we've tried to really make sure that our programs are research-based. So there's a number of there's a lot of research into what kinds of things encourage girls to continue on in science. There's a few really good sources for that if you're interested. The National Girls Collaborative has a lot of information. Sci Girls, which is a PBS production, actually has really good information and the research on this. And a lot of what they talk about is, role models and, sort of girls seeing themselves as being capable in this because they see others who've been successful. So we've worked a lot to bring in women scientists in particular. We're also trying really hard to bring in other minority scientists so that especially our older elementary and middle school programs really have sort of near peer and slightly older role models. You can see yourself there doing this. So we've been working on a project. I was discussing this earlier. We're working on a project now where our middle school program is working on computational thinking, problems that are too dangerous or expensive to do, to try to solve and to experiment with in real life, doing that with very powerful computers and trying to come up with projects that are directed by girls, that people come up with their own questions and their own approaches to solving it. They work collaboratively. Those are all things that encourage girls and don't discourage boys, which is part of the thing we're really trying to do. We don't want to empower girls and somehow disempower somebody else. So we're working hard on that too.
Okay, so I work with young adults in a professional school, so I think my response is going to be a little different.
Perfect.
And as I said, 80% of our students are women. So in terms of, I don't think we have much of an issue. We don't have a problem attracting girls into veterinary medicine. But what we found in the profession is, even though there are so many women, there were gender differences when it came to leadership roles that women were assuming. Even among faculty, there are, even though the profession is predominantly female, the tenure track faculty and the tenured faculty are predominantly male, and you would expect that through the years, as more and more women went into veterinary medicine, that would eventually change just by virtue of who was graduating, but that is not happening. So there is a concerted effort to try to address that through committees and other champions of women leadership within administration and at Cornell in general, but at the vet school. The other thing we noticed that even though, again, women are graduating at much higher rates than overall, many more women graduating in veterinary medicine than men, there was a wage gap. So men were earning, I think, about 15-16% more than the women, and when it was adjusted for other factors, there was still a 6-7% difference in wages. So there is, the gender gap persists, the discrimination in many ways persists, even though it's a predominantly female field. The third thing that we noticed was that men tend to, more often than women, veterinarians tend to pursue practice ownership. And practice ownership is much more lucrative. So just by virtue of that, women were going into associate positions and being content to stay in associate positions, whereas men were more likely to be interested in purchasing practices. So there's a lot more emphasis being put on leadership development and business development, so that those skills are developed so that the playing field can be leveled. So it's a slightly different take on what what needs to be nurtured.
I can usually tell you what doesn't work better than what does work. So for a couple of years, I was working to try to increase enrollment in high school at pre-engineering sequences, and what doesn't work is when you create girls-only classes. We tried to create a girls-only class for a pre-engineering sequence, and I think 3 girls signed up for it. So we have actually backed up when we introduce engineering and the emphasis we place on coding and engineering into first, second, and third grade, because by the time they get to the high school, that mindset about who you are as a student and what you're interested in has in a lot of ways been formed. And so getting students to see themselves doing science really early in really open-ended scenarios where they're creating solutions to problems, which has been really mandated by a new set of instructional standards in New York State, has really shifted our focus as a district, so that by the time we get them in 9th grade, the hope is that they visualize themselves going through rigorous science, rigorous math, and rigorous engineering programs that we have at the high school.
Great. That leads me to my next question. I was thinking a lot about how women and Black and Latinx and minority women face discrimination and bias and feelings of microaggressions that aggregate and can hinder success. So in your experiences, what do you see as some of the most powerful balms that support women to stay in their fields and continue this work? Have you come across anything yet?
I read the question. I thought,
Yeah.
wow, that's an amazing question, and we could all go for the Nobel Prize once we found the answer to that. But
Collective impact.
but I do think there's something about being in a supportive environment as much as possible. And I'm going to just, it might be a little bit of an aside, but I want to just say something about a research study I just heard about recently, because it sort of strikes me about this sort of how you see yourself and where you see yourself in the future is sort of how this all fits together. I was just recently at a research conference. There's research coming out of NYU and Princeton. They took a bunch of children and they either gave them the phrase, today we're going to be scientists, and scientists are people that, and then gave them an activity, or they gave them the phrase, today we're going to do science, and scientist is doing something, and they gave them the same activity. And they found for girls and minorities that using the phrase, we're going to do science, led to statistically more perseverance with the task than telling them that they were going to be scientists, which seemed counterintuitive to me. Because we sort of work on this, like today, young engineers we're going to, or today, scientists we're going to. And this idea of, the hypothesis about why that is because they don't see it themselves in those roles. They don't see women, they don't see minorities in those roles, so they don't see that as, it's an imaginary thing then. We may as well be playing princess, or, today we're going to be a fairy tale character, as opposed to today we're going to do something that we can all do together. And so when you talk about sort of how to have a balm for microaggressions, I think it's about making welcoming environments. I think it's about showing role models. It's about giving opportunities to play and be successful so that you can.
I'm going to approach this a little differently. And more from your question about the supportive environment and how do you get people to realize microaggressions and how do you support people. So one of the programs we've started, and this wasn't specifically to build a supportive environment for women in the college. It was generally to build a supportive environment, period, for any group, build an inclusive community at the college. But I think it applies to any one of these groups, is that on on a monthly, we have a series at the vet school called Many Voices, One College, and the whole point is to build an inclusive community. And as part of that, we've had people from different backgrounds, and we draw on leadership, college leadership, so that people can see role models and people can see people in positions of power and authority come and share their stories, and they're very, very candid stories. So whether they are stories of having overcome disabilities, or having dealt with how choices made, and how they were impacted by being a black male, or we had another administrative leader who talked about being lesbian and being obese, and what obesity means in this community, and how invisible she felt. But we have had tremendous feedback about those kinds of stories in terms of how people feel that they feel connection to people. They feel that it's a supportive environment by virtue of understanding someone's story. So I think, in terms of building a community of women and supporting women in a science discipline, I'm just wondering if something like that can be developed so people can tell their stories and see people who've achieved, understand their stories, both men and women, understand where people are coming from and how they got to where they were, and understand what their biases, subconscious or unconscious, or biases may be as they're watching that person tell that story. Anyway.
I would just add that there's sort of two poles I think of to diminishing barriers to all students, whatever gender, level, ethnicity. One of them is early, the idea of getting rid of levels of coursework early. So early in middle school and early in high school, the idea that you come in with everybody and all experience and educational environment together, and that you don't come in necessarily being predetermined into a track of success or a track of no success, or this idea of you're honors, you're not honors, you're an AP student, you're not an AP student, so that students can find their own sort of pathway through secondary programming. And the other end of that is that by the end of high school, really trying to develop courses that are appealing to a huge number of students by picking things that are popular in the media or that are popular in our community, and designing courses that really specialize in those interests. And we've had great success in courses like forensics and sustainable agriculture and marine biology that all used to be courses that you couldn't take till later in college. And the idea of offering a very small snippet into a course that you've seen on Bones or CSI or whatever, that the idea that women are out there doing things all over the television, and then trying to create programming within our schools that meets that interest. And so as a junior and senior, developing those and supporting kids as they enter food science. And a lot of that is based off, too many grad school nights of watching a lot of television, but it seems to work.
That's the last that works, yeah.
Can I add something to that? I think it's interesting. We all have sort of this very academic take, right? What do you do with kids? What do you, how do you set them up for success at the end of, when they're at the late teens, early 20s, And I think one of the other things that's really important is to also know that who you are at 18 is not necessarily who you are at 28, and that is not necessarily who you are at 38. And I think that's really telling from this movie, right? Who she was at 16 was not who she was, in 1942. So I think, there's also that sort of making sure that you give people opportunities to start over or to look for new things or to reinvent themselves. And as a community, we have to be thinking about that too. Because I think we're very focused on making sure, trying to keep people in the pipeline, trying to keep people, with as many options as possible. And I think that's through all of adulthood even.
I wanted to follow up. I just have a point. I wanted to hear your feedback. One of the things that's interesting about in Hedy's case is that she's not a trained scientist. She's not going through this. She's an inventor. She's a creative. I mean, and I think people tend to think of, unfortunately, science is seen as something that's very, sort of, if anything, not creative. It's in its own space, where I think, in fact, she shows a wonderful example of how, these various ideas can come together. You can imagine, it's a very visual, creative. I can only imagine the kind of the way in which she creates the associations that would help her come up with an idea. And I don't think that, unfortunately, I don't know if this is happening in the school system, that it doesn't work like that because of the fact that the curriculums are so focused for state exams and all this stuff that one doesn't really have that. But I feel like Ithaca is a kind of community. If anything, you would expect something like this. I mean, for example, I know there's the inventor. Isn't it like the inventor? It's like a space where people come in and do computer stuff. I think not only should it be something for children, but even for adults. Kind of creative STEAM spaces, but really for everybody, not just for a particular age. Because I think, as you rightly pointed out, who we were when we were at 16 is not necessarily where we're at as we age. So I do think it's an interesting question though about how does a person like I think she's obviously in a sad way trapped because we didn't really have a society that could actually allow a person to be sort of to think in those terms, to be creative in that sense, because women were much more limited, I think, in terms of how they could present themselves outside of a particular role.
I really like that point about the limitation of school and the limitation of curriculum. And I think that it's very slow, but there's a shift happening, especially in science education. The next generation science standards were rolled out probably about 5 years ago and adopted by most states. New York adopted them and just named them the New York standards. But the point is that what the expectations of those standards do is actually really shift from coming up with an answer to proposing a solution to a problem that we've either created ourselves or a problem that is happening currently. And that starts in kindergarten, and that's huge, and it isn't happening across the board or in every classroom, but it's certainly a big shift from what we had. So
what's funny is I saw a video a couple years ago about how Earth Science kids were being prepared to take the New York State exam, whatever. It's so completely different now than how it used to be, and it says a lot about how they want us to go about reasoning, so critical thinking approaches to science. And on the one hand, it's an interesting point, but I feel like that's a creative activity that I think it's a way of thinking about science and as for boys or girls, I don't think it's a gender thing. And I think if we change the framing, the labels or whatever, I think could actually include more people in science.
I think the other thing about that struck me is not just the creativity, but the collaborative nature. She didn't know the entire solution to how to do it. She had this idea, and she needed to find other people who could to help her execute it. Right? The idea of the player piano wasn't her part of the idea. And I think that's something we are working on both in schools and at the Science Center and in the community, is really coming up with ways of being successful as groups, and as opposed to, if I got it right, I'm doing better than you because you didn't get it right. Let's see if we can come up with a solution together.
So one of the things that, business schools and engineering schools probably are very familiar with this, but at Cornell they have what they call these hackathons, where groups get together and have these sessions where they invent, and it's interdisciplinary student teams. And we started doing that at vet school. We just do it once a year, and it's called Animal Hackathon. And it's really amazing because we draw from the business school and we draw from the engineering school because we do need computer scientists and coders. We also need people who understand business because they have to pitch. But these are students who are medical students who are in classes studying, medicine and how to diagnose and treat and all of that. But for 2 days, they spend this time with this interdisciplinary team that they identify. I mean, anyone can come up with an idea. They seek out their own. They pitch their idea to the larger group. They form a small team, depending on who is interested in their idea, and they actually develop. For the Animal Hackathon, the only caveat is that the product needs to be somewhat animal focused. And it's so funny because there was a team that came up with a way to a spray that you could spray on the back of your dog so that poop wouldn't stick to the back. I mean, the clean butt, right? Then there was another. I mean, they'd come up with all these really crazy but fun things, and it was quite exhilarating for them. But things like that, I think that at the elementary and even at the elementary schools,
Absolutely,
that kids
yes.
could do, I think, would be so much fun and really engage them. But
Absolutely. I want to echo both what you mentioned about this collaborative and interdisciplinary aspect of learning in life as human beings, right? And how I think very slowly we are learning in the formal education system to build more opportunities for children to do that, to value that more in terms of how we prepare teachers. My final question was about what's most exciting to you in your field about this work. And my own answer, if I should be so bold to give it, I've worked in the field of teacher professional development at Ithaca College, and reading and learning about how schools are starting to prepare teachers to understand the value of interdisciplinary learning more, to understand the value of the spaces they create in their classrooms to be emotionally safe and collaborative, and to build in understandings of themselves and their bias and the beliefs that all children should have about their capabilities and growth areas. So that's super exciting for me, both to hear about that field growing and also to have a small hand in, this week I was doing a biomimicry STEM challenge with first graders. And we spent a whole week dreaming big about how nature could inspire us to solve a problem of moving safely from one building across a busy street to another. And even at first grade, some of the kids, after a day of like, okay, what are you going to actually imagine? And a kid had a dinosaur in his, that robot that was, grounded in fact and using chemicals that it spit to stop cars. And a kid in the class stopped and said, doesn't this need to really work? And we were all just like, no, just keep dreaming, right? And it was super exciting. And I think that, as Carlan was saying, we have actually standards in New York State and across the country that envision an incredibly rich experience for children that applies the work in ways that appeals to the human brain and builds a bigger table for women and young girls to be there. So that's super exciting to me. So I don't know if any of you have to wrap up something that's exciting for you in your field.
I just count on you to drop the mic now, so no one can follow that, Jen. I don't have anything to contribute. That's more poetic than that, but.
But I was going to say we do the same thing for Head Start, actually. To work with Head Start, we work with Head Start teachers with this idea of what is science, right? Science is how you process the world around you. It's not a body of knowledge. It's it's just how you right. So it's that same sort of that we can just come together and play, and kids can get messy, and we're still doing science. And in fact, the scores for Head Start have increased in science, and I actually, in my heart of heart, thinks it's not because the kids are doing more science or learning more science. It's because the teachers are recognizing it as science. The same stuff is now being recognized differently, and I think that that's been really very powerful. And I think it's sort of the same thing as you're talking